At 7:50 a.m., the quiet of Russell Avenue was shattered by a sound no one could mistake for fireworks once the echoes faded. 15 rapid gunshots tore through the morning air, violent and relentless, leaving neighbors frozen at their windows. In the driveway of a small home, a Jeep Cherokee sat with its driver's side door open, riddled with bullet holes. Inside, slumped against her seatbelt, 34-year-old Mariah Samuels gasped her final breath. Her killer didn't flee in chaos or panic. He walked away, calm and unhurried, leaving behind a trail of brass casings that gleamed in the rising Sunday. Hours earlier, Mariah had typed her final words to the world, words that now read like prophecy. Clearly, the protective order isn't doing. It was her last warning, a cry for help that went unanswered. How did a woman who had done everything right, filed reports, obtained protection, called the police, documented her abuse, end up executed in her own driveway by a man who had just walked free after 15 years in prison? To understand that moment, we have to rewind, back to the beginning. Mariah Rosanna Samuels was the kind of woman people remembered with a light in their voice. A single mother of 2 boys, she worked mornings at Petco in Minneapolis, where she groomed anxious dogs with such gentle patience that even the most difficult animals relaxed in her hands. Her smile had a way of making strangers feel seen, and her laugh filled the room with warmth. Her Instagram was full of snapshots of travel and adventure, beaches in Thailand, markets in Mexico, waterfalls in Jamaica. She wanted her sons to know that the world was larger than Minnesota, that life was meant to be lived and experienced. But beneath the smiling photographs and bright adventures was a woman carrying enormous responsibility. Her eldest son was 18, preparing for college, while her youngest was just 11, still in need of nightly homework help. She juggled multiple jobs to keep their home on Russell Avenue North, never letting her boys feel how heavy the burden truly was. And then, one spring, she met David Wright. He was 50, carrying himself with the polished charm of someone who said he wanted a second chance at life. He spoke of lessons learned, of mistakes behind him, and promised stability. For a woman constantly balancing chaos and responsibility, that stability seemed like a blessing. At first, Wright played the part perfectly. He sent flowers to her job, offered to run errands, showed up to her son's activities with a smile. He made her laugh, and for a time she believed she had found someone steady. But the stability he promised was an illusion. What began as affection soon revealed itself as control. Wright memorized her daily schedule with precision when she left for work, when her son came home from school, when she spent evenings at her sister Simone's house. Friends noticed the change. Mariah, once lively on social media, grew quiet. At a summer barbecue, her coworker counted 17 missed calls from Wright in a single hour. 17 calls. Mariah's hands trembled as she finally turned the phone off. By midsummer, his devotion had become obsession. He appeared at restaurants uninvited, interrogated her about men who smiled at her, and shadowed her movements. Tired of justifying her every step, Mariah ended the relationship. That decision turned her world upside down. On August 26, she was on the phone with a friend when Wright appeared at her back door. He didn't knock, he simply stood there, staring through the glass. When she refused to let him in, he circled the house, rattling windows, testing doors. Her friend, still on the call, listened in horror. "Leave me alone," Mariah shouted, but the commotion grew louder, the sound of glass shattering, furniture crashing. Wright had forced his way inside. What followed was brutal. He struck her with a pistol, blows that left knots on her head, bruises along her body, scratches from being dragged across the floor. At one point, he pressed the barrel to her temple, and asked in a chilling whisper, "Do you really want to die over another man?" By the time police arrived, he had fled. Officers photographed her injuries, filed reports, documented everything. That same day, Mariah sought an order of protection, and the court granted it immediately. On paper, she was safe. For almost 2 weeks, she began to exhale. She returned to her routines, celebrated her 34th birthday quietly with her family, and believed perhaps the worst was behind her. But David Wright was still waiting. On September 12, her phone lit up with a message from a burner number. Wright apologized, begged her to accept his birthday gifts, pleaded for her forgiveness. "I love you, Mariah," he wrote. "I'll regret that night for the rest of my life." Mariah didn't respond. Instead, she opened Facebook. Her post was sharp, furious. "I can't stand a human being who can't take accountability." Replace the word man with coward. An hour later, she posted again, this time, the footage from her own security cameras, showing Wright attacking her. The evidence was undeniable, but exposure did not bring safety. In the early hours of September 14, her cameras caught him again, prowling around her property, circling her car, peering through her windows. At 4 a.m, she called police. By the time officers arrived, he had vanished. Exhausted and terrified, Mariah returned to Facebook, typing her final words. "Stalking me at 4 inches the thing morning, and the police ain't doing. Clearly, the protective order isn't doing." It was her last post. The next morning, as she sat in her Jeep, preparing to leave for work, Wright approached. Neighbors watched in horror as he opened fire, bullets tearing through glass and steel. He circled the vehicle, firing again and again. 15 shots in less than 30 seconds. Mariah slumped against her seatbelt, her body riddled with wounds. He tried to drag her from the car, but she was caught in place. He gave up, looked around, and walked away. Not ran, walked. Calm, unhurried. Mariah died in the place she should have been safest, her own driveway. And here lies the question that lingers like a ghost. How could a woman who did everything right, who called for help, who filed for protection, who documented her abuse, still end up executed in broad daylight? What good is a piece of paper when the system built for protection cannot protect? The gunfire had barely faded on Russell Avenue when the manhunt began. The name David Wright spread through Minneapolis like wildfire. Every officer had his face. Every patrol car carried his description. This wasn't just a local search. Because Wright was on federal probation, his crime triggered the involvement of the U.S. Marshals. Almost instantly, he wasn't just a fugitive, he was now one of the most wanted men in Minnesota. By mid-morning, detectives began to piece together how he escaped. In an alley 2 blocks away, they found a bicycle leaning against a garage, fingerprints smudged along its frame. Witnesses had seen a man in dark clothing pedaling slowly through the neighborhood just before the shots rang out. The bike, stolen hours earlier, was his getaway vehicle, quiet, untraceable, a way to slip through the city unseen. For investigators, it was the first sign that this wasn't a crime of sudden passion. It was a calculated execution. The All Points Bulletin went statewide within hours. Wright's mugshot, aged but recognizable, flashed across the screens of officers from Minneapolis to Duluth. His federal identification number 05891-041 lit up databases across the Midwest. The U.S. Marshals' Violent Fugitive Task Force was activated. Airports, bus stations, and train terminals were scanned with facial recognition systems. Highways were monitored. For a man who thought of himself as cunning, the net was closing fast. But David Wright wasn't hiding in another state. He wasn't planning a daring escape. 19 hours after the murder, the phone rang inside a small motel off Highway 10 Anoka. The manager's voice was uneasy. A man had checked in under a false name, paying cash. The ID looked suspicious, but it was his face the clerk recognized. The same face plastered across every news channel. She made the call, and within minutes officers were racing to the scene. 17 officers from 3 agencies surrounded the motel. They established a perimeter, evacuated nearby rooms, and prepared for a violent standoff. At 3:14 a.m., they breached the door. But the chaos they expected never came. Wright was sitting calmly on the bed, fully dressed, his hands already raised. "I knew you'd find me," he said, his voice steady, almost bored. There was no struggle, no attempt to flee. Just one question, delivered with chilling detachment as the cuffs tightened around his wrists. Did she suffer? The word sent a shiver through even the most seasoned officers. What kind of man murders a woman in broad daylight, then asks if her pain was enough? Was it curiosity, sadism, or simply another twisted attempt to maintain control, even in defeat? Back in Minneapolis, Wright was placed in interview room 3 at police headquarters. He waived his right to a lawyer without hesitation. "I'm not going to fight this situation," he told detectives before they even asked a question. "This isn't going to be a hard-fought case." Detective Thompson read him his rights again, making sure he understood. Wright nodded. His voice never wavered as he explained why Mariah had to die. "Read our text messages," he said. "All of them. Then you'll understand why I did what I did." For 3 hours, he spoke, unraveling a story of obsession and control. He described their relationship in disturbing detail, how he memorized her routines, how he tracked her movements, how her decision to leave him felt like betrayal. He said the protection order was disrespect. He said her Facebook posts were an attack. And the surveillance footage she shared with the world, the video, showing him dragging and striking her, that, he said, was the final straw. "She was trying to destroy my reputation," he insisted. He claimed she was seeing another man. He claimed she lied to ruin him. Investigators found no evidence of either. The bruises on her body and the footage from her cameras told the only truth that mattered. Every word revealed what detectives already suspected. Wright wasn't motivated by love or heartbreak. He was motivated by control. To him, every step Mariah took to protect herself was an insult. Every silence was resistance. Every moment she spoke out was war. And in his twisted logic, war justified execution. But what chilled investigators more than Wright's words was what they uncovered in their own files. The assault on August 26, the night he pistol-whipped Mariah in her home, had been documented in detail. Police had taken photographs of her injuries. They had written full reports. Yet that file had never reached the county attorney's office. It sat in limbo, collecting dust. When pressed, a Minneapolis sergeant claimed Mariah had declined to press charges. But her actions told another story. Filing for protection, posting video evidence online, calling police again and again. Her family rejected the explanation outright. Advocates called it what it was: systemic indifference, because pressing charges requires time, paperwork, hearings, resources. And too often, survivors like Mariah were left to carry the burden of proof alone. Every day that file sat ignored was another day. Wright remained free. Another day he could stalk, plan, and prepare. Another day closer to the 15 shots that ended her life. The days following his arrest were a blur of grief and outrage. Hennepin County Attorney Mary Morarty filed charges quickly. Second-degree murder and illegal possession of a firearm. The evidence was overwhelming his confession. The text messages, the Facebook posts, the surveillance video, the witnesses who saw him circle her Jeep, the stolen bicycle marked with his fingerprints. At his first court appearance, Judge Patricia Kelly set his bail at $1 million. His federal probation was automatically revoked. Whatever the outcome of the state case, Wright was destined for prison again. But this time, it wasn't drugs. This time, it wasn't weapons. This time, it was murder. As Wright shuffled out of the courtroom in shackles, he turned his head toward the gallery. Mariah's sister Simone sat in the front row, her eyes burning with rage. He met her gaze and muttered, almost casually, "Tell her boys I'm sorry." Simone's reply cut through the room like a blade. "You're not sorry," she spat. "You're just caught." Outside the courthouse, advocates gathered with candles and signs. They had seen this story too many times before. Different faces, different names, but the same ending. Survivors begging for safety, filing for protection, only to be buried anyway. One advocate said it plainly. Mariah did everything she was supposed to do. And she's still dead. And that is the tormenting truth at the heart of this case. David Wright pulled the trigger, but the system gave him the chance. A protection order is only as strong as the paper it's printed on. Police reports are only as powerful as the prosecutors who act on them. Survivors are only as safe as the society willing to fight for them. Mariah trusted that system, and it failed her at every turn. The manhunt ended with Wright in custody, but the questions remained, hanging in the air like smoke. What happens to the women who survive, but are silenced by fear? How many reports gather dust in filing cabinets while abusers walk free? How many more Mariahs will die before protection becomes more than paperwork? And through it all, one detail refused to fade, echoing in the minds of every detective who heard it firsthand. The question Wright asked as they put him in cuffs, the last thing he wanted to know after taking her life. Did she suffer? There's still more to uncover: her family's fight for justice, the marches that followed, and the devastating truth that Mariah's story was not unique. There's so much more that will leave you shaken. If you find it worth hearing, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next part. The morning after the murder, Russell Avenue looked like a wound carved into the city. Yellow police tape still fluttered in the breeze, cutting across driveways and fences. Bloodstains lingered on the concrete, not yet washed away by rain. Neighbors left flowers at the edge of the driveway, their bright petals a stark contrast to the dull gray pavement stained red. The air itself felt heavy, thick with silence and grief. For Mariah's family, the loss was unbearable. Her 2 boys were kept at their grandmother's house, shielded from the worst details, though nothing could soften the truth. The mother who packed their lunches, helped with homework, and cheered from the sidelines was never coming home. And word spread fast. What had happened to Mariah was not just a tragedy, it was a failure. Within days, her neighborhood transformed into something else. A gathering place, a shrine, a battleground. 5 days after the murder, more than 150 people crowded outside her home. Friends, co-workers, advocates, and even strangers drawn by her story. They carried candles, purple ribbons, Mariah's favorite color, and signs demanding justice. At the front stood her cousin, Tywan Taylor Clark. She had driven all night from Georgia as soon as she heard. Tywan was no stranger to this kind of grief. She was the founder of Jen's Hope House, a shelter for survivors of domestic violence. She had seen this ending before. Different names, different cities, but the same cruel story. Her voice cracked as she spoke through a megaphone. but her words were sharp enough to cut through the night. Mariah did everything she was supposed to do. She called the police. She filed reports. She got the protective order. She even posted evidence online when the system failed her. And she's still dead. If doing everything right doesn't keep you alive, what are we telling survivors? The crowd erupted, chanting through tears. Justice for Mariah. No more paper shields. The march wound through the streets until they reached the precinct. There, participants tied hundreds of purple ribbons to the fence, each one representing a life scarred or ended by domestic violence. Some carried photos of Mariah, her smile frozen in time. Others waved copies of actual protective orders from women across Minnesota, not symbolic, not props, but real documents yellowed with age or freshly printed. Each one a desperate plea. Keep me safe. But the bitter truth was undeniable. Protective orders were not shields. They were paperwork. Documentation that acknowledged danger but rarely prevented it. In 2024 alone, Minnesota courts issued around 15,000 protective orders. Violations occurred in nearly 40% of cases. Arrests for those violations? Less than 10%. The math was brutal. For every 10 times an abuser ignored a protective order, 9 times nothing happened. 9 opportunities to escalate, to stalk, to terrorize, to kill. Dr. Patricia Gonzalez, director of the Minnesota Coalition for Battered Women, spoke bluntly to reporters at the vigil. In 2024, there were 18 domestic violence homicides in this state. In 17 of those cases, there were prior police reports. In 12, protective orders existed. Mariah Samuels represents not the exception, but the rule. These aren't failures of individual officers. This is structural. The system is built to document violence, not to prevent it. Her words rang like a funeral bell. Documentation, not prevention. Paper shields against bullets. For Mariah's family, the statistics weren't numbers, they were names. Mariah was the 4th woman in their family murdered by a man who once claimed to love her. Her aunt wept on camera. 4 women. How many more before it ends? Our daughters, our sisters, our mothers, we are burying them while the men who kill them get to tell their side of the story in court. Her sister Simone stood in silence for most of the vigil, clutching a framed photo of Mariah. When she finally spoke, her voice cracked with rage. He didn't just kill her, he tried to erase her. But she told the world who he was before he pulled that trigger. And now it's on us to make sure no one forgets. What made Mariah's story even more haunting was how public her struggle had been. Unlike so many survivors silenced by fear, Mariah had spoken loudly. She posted messages, photographs, even videos. She warned anyone who would listen. He is stalking me. The police aren't doing anything. The order isn't working. Her posts were time-stamped, proof of a system failing in real time. They weren't whispers in the dark. They were alarms blaring on social media. And still, nothing changed. After her death, those posts went viral. Shared across Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, people reposted her words with anger. Clearly, the protective order isn't doing. It became a rallying cry. A haunting reminder that Mariah had seen her death coming, and the system had let it happen. In living rooms across Minnesota, survivors saw themselves in Mariah. Women with protective orders folded in drawers. Women who had heard knocks at 3 a.m. and held their breath in silence. Women told, "Just call us if he shows up," only to wait hours for help that never came. Mariah's murder wasn't just her story. It was theirs too, proof of what they already feared. that the law would not save them when it mattered most. Reporters pressed city officials. Why wasn't the August assault prosecuted? Why wasn't Wright under stricter supervision, given his federal record and prior protection orders? Why wasn't his stalking on September 14 treated as urgent enough to prevent the bloodshed that followed? The answers were vague. Too many cases, limited resources, survivors sometimes choosing not to pursue charges. But none of it explained why a woman who had done everything right was gunned down in broad daylight. None of it comforted two boys who would grow up without their mother. At Mariah's vigil, Tywan Clark closed the march with words that cut to the heart of the matter. This isn't about one family, one woman, one city. This is about every survivor holding a piece of paper and wondering if it will stop a bullet. About every police report that gets filed away instead of acted on. About every time a woman is told, "We'll keep you safe," and then ends up a headline. We have to decide, do we want to keep documenting violence, or do we want to stop it? The crowd fell into silence. Her words hung in the air like a weight no one could shake off. Mariah's death couldn't be undone. But her story was becoming something larger. A catalyst, a demand, a banner for reform. Her family vowed to keep her name alive, not just as a victim, but as proof that the system was broken. And as purple ribbons swayed against the chain-link fence that night, one question lingered in every heart. If the system can't protect the women who do everything right, what chance do the rest have? The trial of David Eugene Wright began months after the gunfire on Russell Avenue, but the grief in Mariah's family had not faded. The flowers left at her memorial had long since wilted. The purple ribbons tied to fences had weathered in the sun, but the pain in her children's eyes remained raw and unrelenting. Each day they entered the courthouse was another reminder of what they had lost, another reminder that the woman who should have been there to guide them into adulthood was gone forever. David Wright entered the courtroom shackled, his face impassive, his eyes scanning the gallery with the same arrogance he carried when he still believed he had control. But this time, the illusion of power was gone. The mountain of evidence against him was overwhelming: his own confession, the text messages, the Facebook posts, the stolen bicycle with his fingerprints, the video footage of the assault, the eyewitnesses who had seen him circle Mariah's Jeep before unloading 15 bullets into her body. The prosecution painted a picture of premeditation so chilling that the room seemed to grow colder with each word. Wright hadn't snapped in a fit of rage. He had stalked, planned, and executed. He had stolen a bicycle to avoid detection, memorized her morning routine, and fired from multiple angles to ensure her death. This was not passion. This was not a mistake. This was execution. And then came Mariah's own voice, projected through the posts she left behind. The jury read her words on a screen. Clearly, the protective order isn't doing. The courtroom fell silent. It was as though she had spoken her own epitaph hours before her murder. The jurors stared at the words. The weight of them, undeniable. The defense had little to offer. They attempted to suggest Wright felt provoked by Mariah's public posts, humiliated by her decision to share the video of his abuse. They hinted at mental health struggles, at a man overwhelmed by rejection. But nothing they said could erase the surveillance footage of him circling her car, the methodical sound of gunfire in the testimony of neighbors, or the chilling confession he had given detectives himself. The prosecution closed with words that silenced even the shuffle of papers. Mariah Samuels did everything right. She called the police. She filed reports. She obtained a protection order. She documented her abuse. She begged for help. And still, she is dead. The only question left is whether we will let this man escape accountability one more time. It didn't take long. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning with a verdict. Guilty on all counts. Second-degree murder. Illegal firearm possession. Violation of probation. Judge Patricia Kelly's voice was steady as she looked right in the eye and delivered the sentence. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. The words landed with a heavy, bittersweet finality. He would never walk free again, never stalk another woman, never terrorize another family. But for Mariah's loved ones, there was no victory, because it did not bring her back. It could not erase the memory of 15 gunshots in the early morning air. As he was led out of the courtroom, shackled and silent, Wright glanced toward the gallery where Mariah's family Saturday. He muttered, almost casually, "Tell her, boys, I'm sorry." Simone, her sister, stood with tears in her eyes, her voice cracking with fury. "You're not sorry. You're just caught." Outside the courthouse, cameras swarmed as Mariah's family addressed reporters. Simone held her head high, her voice trembling but strong. "This verdict doesn't bring my sister back, but it tells her boys that her life mattered, that her voice was heard, even when the system failed to listen while she was alive. And it ensures that man will never hurt another woman again." Her cousin Taiwan stood beside her, gripping a megaphone, speaking to the crowd that had gathered. "This is not the end," she declared. "Mariah's story will not be another statistic. We will keep marching. We will keep fighting. Because the system that failed her still exists. And if it doesn't change, more women will die." The chants rose once again. Justice for Mariah. No more paper shields. The echoes of those chants reached beyond the courthouse steps. In the months that followed, lawmakers in Minnesota felt the pressure. Advocates demanded reform, stricter enforcement of protective orders, mandatory follow-ups on violations, increased oversight of probation officers. Bills were introduced. Debates grew heated, and though change was slow, Mariah's name became a rallying cry inside legislative halls. Her story forced uncomfortable questions to the surface. Why are protective orders so rarely enforced? Why are survivors told to document abuse, only for those files to gather dust in drawers? Why is accountability placed on the shoulders of the abused, while the abuser moves freely through their lives? There were no easy answers. Only the truth. Written in blood. The system had failed. For her 2 sons, life would never return to normal. The eldest filled out college applications without his mother's encouragement. The youngest celebrated his 12th birthday without her smile in the crowd. Their grandmother stepped in to raise them, while the house on Russell Avenue became a shrine too heavy to bear. But the family promised Mariah's boys would grow up knowing the truth of who she was. Not just a victim, but a fighter. A woman who refused to be silenced, who documented her abuse, who left behind undeniable proof of the man who took her life. "Remember her name," her cousin Taiwan told reporters. "Not just because she died, but because she warned us, because she told the truth, and because she deserved better than a paper shield." And so, the story of Mariah Samuels lingers not only in court files and police reports, but in the posts she left behind. Digital echoes of her final warnings, frozen in time on social media. Her last words, typed in desperation, now read like prophecy. Clearly, the protective order isn't doing. It is a haunting reminder that justice after death is not enough. That until protection becomes prevention, until the system is rebuilt to act instead of simply document, there will be more vigils, more marches, more names whispered in grief. The verdict put David Wright behind bars forever. But it left one question hanging in the air. unanswered, and unbearable. If doing everything right couldn't save Mariah, what will it take to save the next woman? The courthouse verdict brought a measure of finality, but it did not bring peace. For Mariah's family, the sentencing of David Wright to life without parole was only the closing of one chapter. Outside, as the cameras and crowds faded, the reality remained. A mother was still gone. Her 2 sons still forced to grow up without her. No sentence could restore what the bullets had taken, but her story had ignited something larger. Within days of the trial, lawmakers, advocates, and citizens began demanding answers. If Mariah could not be protected despite doing everything the system told her to do, what hope was there for anyone else? The phrase she had typed in despair clearly, "The protective order isn't doing," became more than a Facebook post. It became a rallying cry. Protests surged through Minneapolis. Marchers carried signs bearing her face and words. No more paper shields. Justice for Mariah. Protective orders should protect. Her name echoed through the streets, chanted by strangers who had never met her, but who saw their own stories in hers. Survivors stood in crowds, holding their own protection orders in trembling hands. Some yellowed with age, others freshly signed, each one a reminder of how fragile their safety really was. Advocates called for sweeping reforms. They wanted mandatory arrests when orders were violated, stricter supervision of offenders with histories of violence, and penalties for probation officers who failed to follow up. They demanded training for police to treat domestic violence violations as urgent threats, not paperwork to be filed and forgotten. The fight was not just for Mariah but for every woman who had called for help and been ignored. Legislators could no longer dismiss the urgency. In hearings, they listened as Mariah's family and advocates spoke with fire and grief. Her cousin Taiwan raised her voice before the chamber. This system didn't just fail Mariah, it failed all of us. How many times do women have to die before protection becomes more than a piece of paper? If you are not willing to act, then you are complicit. Her words drew silence and then applause. Bills were drafted, proposals introduced. It would take months, even years. But Mariah's name had planted itself in the foundation of change. She would not be forgotten. For her boys, however, the reforms came too late. Their lives had been split into a before and after. Before, there were family trips, late-night homework sessions, their mother's laughter. After, there were grief counseling sessions, courtrooms, and birthdays marked by the absence of her voice. Their grandmother became their anchor, guiding them through the wreckage, reminding them daily of who their mother had been. She fought for you, she told them. She fought for herself, and she left behind proof of the truth. Don't ever let anyone erase her. And yet, for all the progress being pushed forward in her name, one fact haunted those who knew the statistics. Mariah was not unique. Her story was devastating, but it was not rare. In 2024, nearly 40% of protective orders in Minnesota were violated. In 17 out of 18 domestic violence homicides that year, there had been prior reports. In 12, there had been protective orders. Mariah's murder was not an exception. It was part of a pattern. Reporters asked again and again, how many women must die before the system is forced to change? The question lingered in headlines, in legislative chambers, and in households where survivors stared at the piece of paper that was supposed to protect them and wondered if it would mean anything at all when the moment came. For Mariah's family, her legacy was clear: to make sure her story was not swallowed by silence. They organized marches, vigils, and fundraisers. They created scholarships in her name for young women pursuing careers in social justice. They stood in courtrooms beside other survivors, offering support, offering solidarity. Every purple ribbon tied to a fence, every candle lit at a vigil, was a promise. Mariah would not be erased. But beneath the movement, beneath the marches and legislative sessions, there was still the raw, personal grief. Simone carried her sister's photo everywhere she went. Taiwan spoke at shelters across the country, sharing Mariah's story as a warning, as a rallying cry. And two young boys, too young to understand the weight of systemic failure, too old to ever forget their mother's love, lived every day with a wound that could not heal, because no matter how much the system changed, no matter how many laws were rewritten in her name, the truth remained. Mariah had done everything right. She had followed every step, made every call, filed every form, and still, it had not been enough. Her final words on Facebook, once typed in exhaustion and fear, had become her legacy. Clearly, the protective order isn't doing. The system had heard her too late. And now, as advocates carried her story forward, as lawmakers debated reforms, as survivors whispered her name in solidarity, one haunting question remained, echoing louder than the chants in the streets. If the system can't protect the women who do everything right, what chance do the rest have? There's still one final chapter to uncover the lasting legacy of Mariah's story. The reforms that came too late for her but may save others, and the uncomfortable truth about what justice really means when it arrives only after the gunfire. If you believe these stories must be told, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the conclusion. The months after the trial felt like both an ending and a beginning. David Wright would never walk free again. His sentence of life without parole sealed that. But for Mariah's family, there was no such closure. Justice had been served in the courtroom, yet the empty chair at the dinner table, the silence of her voice, the absence of her laughter, could never be filled by a verdict. And still, her story refused to fade. It had sparked something larger, something the system could no longer ignore. Lawmakers faced relentless pressure to answer for the failures that allowed her murder to happen. Advocates carried her name into legislative chambers, reminding officials of the woman who had done everything right and still ended up dead. Survivors across Minnesota, and far beyond, carried Mariah's face on posters and purple ribbons, demanding a world where a protection order meant protection. Slowly, reforms began to emerge. Police departments were ordered to treat violations of protective orders as urgent, not optional. New legislation pushed for stricter oversight of offenders, especially those under probation. Probation officers were required to perform follow-ups, verify employment, and track compliance more closely. For the first time, lawmakers began to ask hard questions about accountability, not just for abusers, but for the system itself. But these changes were shadows of progress, pieces of a puzzle that had been missing too long. They came too late for Mariah. They came too late for the 18 women in Minnesota who had been murdered the year before, 12 of them with protection orders already in place. They came too late for the 4 women in her own family who had lost their lives at the hands of men who once swore they loved them. Her cousin Taiwan, standing before a crowd at yet another vigil, said it plainly. We are building reforms on the graves of women. We are fixing holes only after the water has already drowned our sisters, and we are expected to call that progress. Her voice shook, but the crowd's response roared back. No more paper shields. The phrase had become a movement. Survivors across the country began using it to describe their own stories. Women who had been stalked, harassed, beaten, even killed after obtaining protective orders that did little more than acknowledge their suffering. Mariah's story was no longer just Minneapolis's tragedy. It was every survivor's fear, written in blood. And yet, within her family, grief remained intimate and raw. Her eldest son graduated high school without her in the audience. Her youngest blew out birthday candles without her by his side. Their grandmother did her best to shield them from the weight of advocacy, but her family refused to let Mariah's name fade into statistics. Every scholarship awarded in her memory, every rally where her picture was lifted high, every article that retold her story was a promise that she would not be erased. The haunting part was how much of Mariah's death had been foreseen by her family, even by the women who had come before her. 2 women had filed protection orders against Wright years before, warning courts of his violent control. They survived, but barely. Their petitions were neon signs, flashing danger, and yet nothing was done to stop the pattern. Mariah's own protective order should have been enough. Her calls to police should have been enough. The footage she posted online should have been enough. But none of it was. When asked what could have saved her, advocates gave the same answer: action. Action from police who should have arrested Wright after the August assault. Action from prosecutors who should have pursued charges instead of letting the case linger in limbo. Action from probation officers who should have monitored a man already marked as dangerous. But action never came, only paperwork. That was the bitter truth Mariah's story left behind. The system was designed to record violence, not prevent it. Survivors were told to document, to report, to file, to wait. But predators like Wright thrived in the space between documentation and enforcement, and when that gap closed, it closed around Mariah's life. Her final words still linger online, frozen in time. Clearly, the protective order isn't doing. A cry typed in fear, transformed into a banner for change. Her words, once meant as frustration, had become prophecy. They were printed on protest signs, quoted in legislative halls, etched into the memory of a movement. But as powerful as her legacy became, the question that haunted everyone remained. If Mariah's desperate pleas weren't enough, what will it take to save the next woman? The answer is not simple. Some say harsher penalties, stricter laws, better training. Others say a cultural shift, one where society stops blaming survivors for not leaving fast enough, not staying quiet enough, not doing more. Because Mariah did more than most. She spoke, she documented, she demanded help. And still, she was silenced by 15 bullets in the place she should have felt safest, her own driveway. Her story is a reminder that justice after death is never enough. A verdict doesn't erase terror. A sentence doesn't bring back laughter. Reforms passed in her name can't replace the warmth her boys lost. The true measure of justice will be whether the next woman, standing in the same shoes, is met with action before it's too late. As the ribbons tied in her honor faded in the sun, and as the world slowly turned to the next headline, her family refused to let her be forgotten. They carried her memory forward, not just as a victim, but as a fighter, a mother, a woman who deserved better. And for everyone who heard her story, her name became a haunting reminder: Mariah Samuels. The system failed her. But in telling her story, in carrying her words forward, perhaps the next name will not end in the same silence. Because until these stories stop happening, we have to keep telling them. There are more stories like Mariah's cases that reveal the cracks in the system, the lives lost in those spaces, the resilience of those left behind. If you believe these stories must be heard, don't forget to subscribe so you'll be here for the next one.